Dozens dead, hundreds injured. Rescue crews search for survivors after an earthquake shatters central Italy. Prayers for the victims. Pope Francis celebrates Mass and leads pilgrims in praying the Rosary. Conflict of interest? An AP investigation reveals the flow of money to her family foundation when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. And falling waters. Flood victims in Louisiana still face concerns with more rain in the forecast. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, August 24th, 2016. Italy reports more deaths tonight from a devastating early morning earthquake. At least 120 people have lost their lives. With searchers still combing through the rubble, that number may continue to rise. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. The earthquake caused widespread damage about 80 miles northeast of Rome in 3 small mountain towns. Mary Shovlin reports from Rome.
A desperate search for survivors in central Italy as rescuers pull people like this woman in Amatrice from the rubble, digging through the crumbled pieces of historic buildings blocking streets, making it difficult to get help and heavy equipment to the places with the most damage.
We're going to work because in the next few hours we must continue to bring people alive from beneath the rubble.
The quake striking just after 3:30 in the morning local time when most were sleeping.
It woke us up. It felt like the bed was on rollers.
Michael Gilroy, an American traveler, describing the moment a 6.2 magnitude earthquake rocked central Italy. Tremors felt as far as Rome, nearly 100 miles away.
We ran out to the main area where there's a big chandelier, and the chandelier was just swaying back and forth. And at that point, we knew, and just trying to get out of the building as fast as we can.
Wednesday's earthquake, not the first in recent history for Italy, striking near the site of the massive 2009 quake that killed more than 300 people. As today's death toll climbs, rescue crews scramble, searching for signs of life, knowing every hour counts when it comes to saving survivors.
Join together in prayer so that the Lord Jesus Christ is always there to help relieve our hearts in pain and to provide us peace.
Mary Shovlin joining us from Rome. Mary, have you felt any aftershocks in Rome there since the initial quake hit early this morning?
We have, Brian. We've had several aftershocks, a lot of them unperceptible, but around 2 p.m. here in Rome, we had about a 4.9 on the Richter scale aftershock here, felt all the way here in the Eternal City, so we can only imagine what it felt like there at the epicenter of this destruction, and they're saying we can expect much more over the coming days.
And what are some of the humanitarian initiatives bringing relief to the affected communities?
Well, there's some good news coming out of as day one comes to a close here in Rome and in Italy on this tragedy. Several humanitarian initiatives, the Red Cross, Caritas, Italy, moving things along. The Italian Bishops' Conference pledging €1 million in support for just the initial relief efforts, maybe some to follow after that. We also know that they've asked all the Italian churches on Sunday, September 18th, to take up a special collection for all those affected by the disaster. So there is some good news at the grassroots level, help getting to those who need it.
And how did Pope Francis focus his morning Mass and today's general audience on prayer for these quake victims?
Well, we know through the Italian news agency SIR that Pope Francis called the Bishop of Rieti, one of the hardest hit areas of this earthquake, and he said wanted to express his closeness. He encouraged him not to be afraid, told the people that he was near to them. And so I think just that telephone call, and in that phone call he also told the bishop, I offered the morning Mass for everyone affected by this earthquake. So great words of support from Pope Francis, followed up by the weekly general audience where he set aside his catechesis, Brian, and led all of the faithful in the praying of the sorrowful mysteries for this terrible tragedy.
And the quake damaged the birthplace of St. Benedict in Norcia, Italy. What are you hearing from the monks there?
We've had some reports from those monks in the birthplace of St. Benedict, one of the patron saints of Europe. They had just finished this wonderful restoration of this centuries-old monastery and the church there, and they said in just a matter of seconds, their hard work has been reduced to rubble. They have to start from scratch all over again. But more than that, they're worried about the people of that area in Norcia, asking for prayers for them and to hopefully help them pick up the pieces and get things started again.
And we understand the monks are okay themselves. Mary Shovlin joining us from Rome. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Brian.
And a powerful earthquake shook Myanmar today, killing at least 3 people. Geologists say the magnitude 6.8 quake was far below the Earth's surface, but still caused considerable damage. At least 94 centuries-old pagodas were damaged in Bagan. That damage centered around that country's premier tourist attraction, offering a view of temples stretching to the horizon. There have been several deadly earthquakes in these past few years. In April of this year, more than 600 people were killed in Ecuador. A year earlier, a strong quake in Nepal killed more than 8,000. In August of 2014, an earthquake in China left more than 700 people dead. Some earthquakes, like the one that hit Haiti in 2010, killed hundreds of thousands of people. Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. Militants launch a deadly attack on the American University of Afghanistan. At least 1 person is known dead, 18 are wounded, some critically. A student on the Kabul campus says he heard an explosion and was shot at when he looked out the window. He and other students managed to escape and were later safely evacuated by Afghan security forces. Security forces are still combing the campus in search of the attackers. Lauren Ashburn has reaction to the attack from the White House tonight. Lauren?
Brian, U.S. and Afghan leaders have been concerned about the growth of ISIS in this eastern region. But earlier this week, around 100 American troops deployed to a southern Afghan city at risk of falling to the Taliban. Now, the Taliban have been fighting to overthrow the Kabul government for 15 years. The White House says the shootings at the university highlight tensions all over the country and the difficulty the U.S. and coalition forces have in assisting with peacekeeping.
I think this underscores the significant challenge facing the people of Afghanistan, particularly as it relates to their security situation. But we continue to see the skill and professionalism of Afghan security forces improve.
The president campaigned on ending the war in Afghanistan, but last month he made a decision to leave 8,400 American troops in Afghanistan until the end of his term. Brian?
Thanks, Lauren Ashburn at the White House. Tonight, an Associated Press investigation reveals more than half of Hillary Clinton's private meetings while she was Secretary of State were with donors to the Clinton Foundation. Jason Calvi joins us tonight with more.
Brian, the AP combed through State Department calendars to find out who Hillary Clinton met with while she was Secretary of State. She met or spoke with 154 people the AP describes as having private interests, and at least 85 of them donated to the Clintons' family charity or did so through companies or groups.
The Clinton Foundation says its goals are to help the environment, women, and health.
It's provided life-saving AIDS drugs to 11.5 million people, and all the donors to the foundation have been disclosed.
But the AP finds that 85 donors to the foundation were scheduled to speak with Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State.
About 40 of that number gave more than $100,000 each. About 20 of that number gave more than $1 million each.
Now Republicans are seizing on the report.
Wait till you see ultimately what she did for all of those people.
The AP first asked for Secretary Clinton's calendar and schedules 3 years ago and sued after waiting.
We haven't seen any clear evidence of pay-to-play, despite all of the emails and all of the other materials that we've examined. But there's clearly questions about access.
That access is fueling speculation that donations were the price of admission to see the Secretary of State.
Because there is an implication that when you give those donations that you will have access, and that's pay to play.
Clinton's campaign spokesman Brian Fallon says it is outrageous to misrepresent Secretary Clinton's basis for meeting with these individuals. He called the report a distorted portrayal of how often she crossed paths with Clinton Foundation donors.
The AP investigation gives a snapshot of some of the foundation donors she met. The billionaire behind the Slim Fast diet, who also founded the Center for Mideast Peace, a Wall Street exec who sought to help with visa problems, and a Nobel Peace Prize winning Bangladeshi economist. Clinton supporters say these are the people the secretary should have been meeting with for her work. Brian?
Thank you, Jason Calvi. And billionaire investor George Soros is accused of spending $650,000 trying to influence public opinion before Pope Francis's visit to the U.S. last year. LifeSite News quotes emails provided to WikiLeaks. They say the money was intended to lobby bishops to be more vocally supportive of economic and racial justice. That report has not been independently verified. The American Bar Association changes its model ethics rules for lawyers. With this change, attorneys are prohibited from belonging to an organization, even a church, holding traditional views on marriage and sexuality. Hans von Spakovsky is a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Explain an ABA model ethics rule and what happens next.
The model rules are then often adopted by state bar associations and state Supreme Courts all over the country. And if that rule goes in place, the clear intent of it is to drive lawyers out of the profession who have views that the leaders of the ABA consider to be politically incorrect on sexual orientation, gender identity, et cetera. So, for example, if I, as a lawyer, am involved in a public debate in which I am taking traditional points of view on those issues, an ethics complaint could be filed against me and I could lose my license to practice law.
So the repercussions are serious.
They are extremely serious.
So the law or the rule is not in effect as such yet. It's been modeled at the national level and has to go to local courts, right?
That's right. But as I said, many states simply adopt the ABA model rules without any question. What needs to happen here is state governments all over the country need to be lobbied by lawyers and the public to say you should not adopt this rule.
Doesn't this threaten the religious freedom of you as a lawyer, all your clients?
Yeah, it absolutely does. Look, one of the things lawyers are supposed to do is to represent clients, particularly those that have views that are perhaps in a minority, that may be unpopular, at a current time, and this is going to make it extremely difficult to do that. But that seems to be actually the intent of the leaders who put this in place.
Doesn't the Constitution guarantee our right to belong to a religious organization, a church? How can someone be prohibited from doing that because of their profession?
Well, I believe there are very serious First Amendment problems with this rule. But as you know, if this rule gets adopted in a state and a lawyer has an ethics complaint filed against him or her, he may have to spend a lot of time and a lot of money raising those kind of constitutional defenses and constitutional concerns to avoid having the State Bar Association disbar it.
Hans, as a member of the legal community, are you aware of support for this within the community of lawyers, or will there be an outcry saying, you can't do this?
Well, the ABA House of Delegates adopted this about 2 weeks ago, but there were a lot of complaints and comments, even from some of the other ABA committees, such as the Business Committee, saying that this rule went way too far and would cause all kinds of problems for attorneys across the country. But the House of Delegates didn't listen to that and adopted it anyway.
From the Heritage Foundation, Hans von Spakovsky, it's good to see you again. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, the New York Times hacked. The FBI investigates whether Russian spies are to blame. And pro-life protests. The Thomas More Society tells us about a lawsuit challenging Chicago's so-called bubble zones. The National Weather Service says the entire Amit River in Louisiana is now below flood stage. Water levels are expected to continue to fall. Forecasters are concerned, though, about the chance of more rain. They're watching rainfall rates for a possible flash flood warning since the ground is so saturated. An emergency order is issued to speed up the removal of flood debris in 20 parishes. It allows mattresses, furniture, and carpeting to be taken to construction and demolition landfills. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. The FBI investigates cyber attacks against reporters for the New York Times and other American news organizations. Investigators believe the hackers may be working for Russian intelligence. Wyatt Goolsby reports.
Brian, the New York Times says the attempted cyber attacks were aimed at its Moscow bureau. The FBI suspects Russian hackers have been trying to gain access into the Times servers for several months now.
U.S. authorities suspect the Times is just one of many organizations under attack. Despite the concerns, the newspaper says the hackers were not successful. A Times spokeswoman says, "We are constantly monitoring our systems with the latest available intelligence and tools. We have seen no evidence that any of our internal systems, including our systems in the Moscow bureau, have been breached or compromised." Investigators believe the attacks came from the same Russian hackers who gained access to the computers at the Democratic National Committee this summer.
That this is a Watergate-like electronic break-in.
Earlier this month, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi advised fellow Democrats not to allow family members to answer their phones or read text messages after hackers leaked over 19,000 personal and office emails. Cybersecurity expert David Ansara says Russian hackers have a history of attacking American organizations, including the Pentagon, which is why he says the threat should not be taken lightly.
It is worrisome because I do think it's contributing. It's part of some of their wider efforts to dominate what information is out there, how they respond to information. They're basically information warfare, the way in which they can influence information, influence political and media events. That is a concern.
The Obama administration has not blamed the recent cyber attacks on the Russians, but others are pointing the finger squarely at Vladimir Putin. Brian?
Wyatt Goolsby, thank you. Turkey's president says troops just retook a Syrian border town from ISIS. Turkish tanks crossed the border as part of a military offensive. Vice President Joe Biden, visiting Turkey today, says U.S. jets provided air cover. Turkey presses the U.S. to extradite a Muslim cleric living in Pennsylvania. Fethullah Gulen denies any involvement in last month's failed military coup attempt in Turkey. Vice President Biden urges the Turkish government to be patient with the U.S. legal system. Pro-life sidewalk counselors closely watch the Thomas More Society's lawsuit against the city of Chicago, challenging its so-called bubble zone ordinance. Thomas More attorney Thomas Ulp joining us by Skype from Chicago. Describe Chicago's bubble zone ordinance for us.
Yes, Brian. It basically says that within 50 feet of a clinic entrance, an abortion clinic entrance, there is an 8-foot bubble around each woman entering the clinic. And the ordinance provides that that a sidewalk counselor cannot encroach within that 8 foot without consent for purposes of communicating with the woman for education or protest or to pass a leaflet.
So it sounds as if this ordinance exclusively targets people offering sidewalk counseling outside abortion clinics run by Planned Parenthood. Is it broader than that, or is it that narrow?
Well, the language is very, very clearly intended to engage and prevent sidewalk counseling. It's not applied against the clinic escorts who are attempting to prevent counseling from occurring and ushering the woman into the clinic. So it is, in fact, discriminatorily enacted and applied.
So then on what grounds do you challenge this ordinance?
Well, back in 2000, a similar ordinance in Colorado was upheld by the Supreme Court in Hill v. Colorado. However, in the last couple of years, there have been a couple of Supreme Court cases. The one most recent in Reed versus the town of Gilbert last year, which redefines what test is used in determining the constitutionality of these kinds of ordinances. And right now, with the new law, this ordinance is clearly defined as content-based, meaning that it requires the highest level of government reason for it being held constitutional. We don't think the government can come up with those compelling reasons, and therefore we think that on its face the statute is unconstitutional.
Very quickly, what does this suit seek?
It seeks an injunction to prevent the enforcement of the Chicago ordinance. And,
right.
And the practical outcome is that our sidewalk counselors will be able to engage more freely and communicate more freely as the First Amendment protects them at abortion clinics in Chicago.
And we look forward to updates. Thomas Ulp with the Thomas More Society. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Up next, a federal lawsuit challenges a mandate that could force doctors to perform gender transition surgery on children. And transfer ceremony. The Olympic flag arrives at its new home. The church celebrates the Apostle Bartholomew on this 24th of August. Some scholars believe he's also called Nathaniel, whose story is told in today's Gospel from St. John. St. Bartholomew was martyred in the 1st century in Armenia. He is Armenia's patron saint. Thanks for joining us this Wednesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. The California Assembly passes an amended bill focused on gay or transgender college students. It requires religious colleges and universities to inform students and staff about federal or state exemptions to sex discrimination rules. The Assembly eliminated portions of the bill that threatened to stop the schools from receiving state funding for low-income students. The state Senate must still approve the amendments. The Franciscan Alliance network of hospitals joins 5 states in filing a lawsuit against a new federal regulation. It would force doctors to perform gender transition procedures on children. Lori Wyndham, senior counsel at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, is representing the Franciscan Alliance. Clarify the regulation and the legal challenge to it.
Sure. As you said, we're representing the Franciscan Alliance. This regulation would require doctors to perform gender transition procedures, including on children, even if those procedures are contrary to the doctor's best medical judgment.
Where did this come from? Is it part of Obamacare?
It was originally part of the ACA, and HHS, our favorite agency, recently interpreted that to mean that it had to cover gender transition procedures. This applies to virtually every doctor in the United States.
How does the medical community view these procedures?
These procedures are deeply controversial. The evidence shows that up to 94% of children who have gender dysphoria will grow out of it and will not be seeking lifelong treatment. So it's especially disturbing that these procedures might be mandated, even and especially for children.
So even doctors believe that this is not a healthy thing for children to go through, and yet they're being forced to do so under this regulation. What consequences could they have if they refuse, if they violate, or they are not in compliance, I guess?
Doctors could face lawsuits. If they're working for a hospital, the hospital can get sued. They can lose their job and have a very difficult time finding another one.
Who would shoulder the financial burden, and how much are we talking about?
HHS estimated that this would cost about $949 million nationwide. That applies to taxpayers, insurance companies, and other groups.
This seems to be just one in a string of steps by this administration to force its own thinking. Is it legal? I mean, how are you going to challenge this? What basis?
There are many different bases because this violates the law in many different ways. This is a real overstep by HHS, for the first time reaching out and telling doctors what they're supposed to do, what their medical judgment is supposed to be.
So what is it? Are you going to go on the grounds that it's unconstitutional?
Yes, we've challenged it as unconstitutional. We've challenged it as violating the Administrative Procedures Act, which is a fancy way of saying that the agency has overstepped its constitutional authority. And there are a number of other challenges, including free speech challenges, that we're bringing here.
Lori Wyndham, senior counsel at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, which, by the way, represents EWTN in our challenge of the HHS contraceptive mandate. Lori, it's good to see you. Thanks for being with us.
Brian, thank you for having us.
The Olympic flag travels halfway around the world. It just arrived in Tokyo after the long journey from Rio de Janeiro. Tokyo's governor and Japanese Olympic athletes took part in the airport arrival ceremony. Tokyo very excited about hosting the next Summer Games in 2020. Until tomorrow, for our EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. We leave you tonight looking back at today's moving general audience in St. Peter's Square. Pope Francis prayed the sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary with pilgrims for the victims of today's earthquake. May the souls of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace.